What's going on, everyone? Sega has recently graced us with a remaster of one of their most well-received titles and an easy fan favorite, but with a twist. For the first time in forever, Shadow was given a major role in a game as a fully playable character with his own respectable moveset intact and not just a copy and pasted moveset he shared with Sonic. In fact, I'm 100% sure the last game that featured Shadow with a unique moveset from the Blue Hedgehog was all the way back in Sonic 06. But with Shadow's return, is this game just another remaster that is somehow worse than the original like Sega's previous attempts, or do we have an absolute banger on our hands? I will gladly answer that question, but a few things first. While I intend for this video to focus mainly on Shadow, I will briefly talk about the Sonics before we get into that. Also, I'm about to spoil 90% of this game's content from here on out, so if you want to avoid spoilers, I suggest you bail and come back once you've experienced what the game has to offer first. In case you are unaware, Sonic Generations is originally an anniversary title where the whole gimmick allows you to play as not one, but two Sonics respectfully going by the names of Classic and Modern. Both of them will be revisiting their stages from previous adventures all throughout Sonic's history and giving each of their levels a more modernized look. Act 1 will have you playing through these stages as Classic Sonic, where the levels will play similar to that of a Genesis title, even though the physics are going to feel very different from that era, but it's not enough to make a hindrance to the overall experience. Act 2 on the other hand will have you playing as Modern Sonic and using a more refined version of the boost formula that was introduced all the way back in Unleashed. Gameplay wise, there isn't too much of a difference between the original and this remaster, but there are some new features that were added. Firstly, the game performs much better on modern hardware, as you're now able to experience the entirety of this game at a smooth 60 frames rather than being locked in at 30 like you were before, and the load times have been cut down tremendously to the point where everything feels seamless. On top of this, players have been given a new control scheme this time around, mapping the boost button and the instant spin dash to the triggers rather than having them map to the square button, likely so that it matches up with the same control scheme that was used in Frontiers. So if you're used to the button layout in that game, Sega was looking out for you this time. As for those who still prefer the older method, Sega made sure to keep you covered, as they also gave players the option to switch back to the legacy controls. Both Classic and Modern Sonic are also given the drop spin ability, which became a mainstay ever since it was introduced back in Sonic Mania. While I welcome this with open arms as Classic Sonic because it feels the most natural on him, I found it to be a bit of a pain to have it on Modern, at least here in Generations. Modern always has to do that short air dash every time you want to activate it, which can make it feel a bit clunky to use, and there have been a number of times where I've activated the drop dash by accident. The character already has a method that will let Sonic hit the ground running by simply performing his stomp and boost combo. Furthermore, there isn't too many situations where the drop spin for Modern would have been helpful, unlike the usefulness I've had with it when I was playing Frontiers. While I appreciate the effort to let this move become a Sonic staple in every game moving forward, this is one of the few times where Modern Sonic can live without this ability. The life system has also received a change, as players no longer need to worry about maintaining extra lives, but if you find that to be a bit too easy and want to have that life system in play, you can switch it back to normal in the options menu. The collectibles have also been expanded upon by a tiny bit. While you can still find all of the art pieces and soundtracks by completing the side missions or collecting red rings, you can also find 3 hidden chow in each zone. Though they don't really do anything, they're just there for decorations and bragging rights, I suppose, though I do admit they are adorable as always. Still, it is nice to see that a lot of TLC was put into the Sonic half of this entire package, even though Shadow is the main selling point for this whole game. But before we jump into the edgier side of things, I do have to address an obvious elephant in the room that caused a mixed reaction between fans. And yes, I'm referring to the changes that were made to some of the characters and the story bits. I'm not going to get too knee deep into this, as this is not really my scene, but just to keep it brief, I personally don't agree with any of these changes. It really all boggles down to retroactively changing characters and altering history of an old game where none of that is really necessary, and completely erasing character traits and designs as if you are ashamed of what you originally put out there. Also, if you're going to change the dialogue of a character, you may want to update the reaction or use a different scene altogether instead of leaving everything else the same, because now this cutscene makes Classic Sonic look like he ate the whole island Knuckles is asking about.
Thanks, Sonic. Now then, tell me, where is the rest of my island?
See what I mean? Look, as both a writer and an artist myself, I am very familiar with wanting to fix, rewrite, and redesign certain traits within characters that may not seem all that appealing and make those improvements when necessary. But if it has already been out there for the whole world to see for years up to this point and nobody really made a huge stink about it, there's really no point in fixing what's already in the past. Just save those changes for future installments, test the reception, and depending on how that all pans out, hopefully you'll know what to do from there. Normally, I tell people to play the original, preferably on PC, as it is the best version of that game if they want to experience the original generations with all the older stuff intact. But Sega made that more difficult to do since you can only get the original game through a bundle now instead of by itself. To this day, this is one of the main reasons why I will always be a physical gamer if possible. But that is a whole discussion for another day. Now let's get edgy. When you boot up the game, you'll be given the option to play as Shadow Generations from the jump. No need to play through Sonic's portion at all if you don't want to. Plus, I do love the presentation these screens have as they both fit the characters very nicely, even right down to their respective themes. Shadow's story takes place in the exact same time as Sonic's campaign. While everyone was celebrating Sonic's birthday, Shadow made his way into the Ark after getting word from Gun that they're picking up strange bioactivity up there, and Shadow refuses to leave the space station until he confirms that absolutely nothing is going to happen. If you want to see all of the events that led up to this, there is a web series you can watch right now called Shadow Dark Beginnings over on the Sonic YouTube channel, which I highly recommend you do as it provides further context while also giving you some high quality crispy animation. I'll even do you a solid and drop the link in the video description below. Well, it looks like Shadow made the right call to stay there because it turns out the bio reading was caused by a Doom Eye, leading Shadow to believe that the Black Arms is attempting to make a comeback. His pursuit after the Doom Eye led him into an encounter with the Time Meter, pulling Shadow into the same white space Sonic and his pals were transferred to, and this is when he learns that Black Doom had survived their battle and is planning to use the Time Meter to accelerate his return, then take Shadow's body for himself once Doom has powered up Shadow's body enough times. I'm gonna elaborate more on that later. His encounter with the Time Meter also granted him the opportunity to see Maria and Dr. Gerald for the first time in years after their passing, which definitely slammed Shadow's emotion in the next week. But he is aware that while these two are the real deal, they came from a different time period, and chances are they most likely won't stick around once the Time Meter anomaly is straightened out. So now Shadow has to stop Black Doom from returning and restore things back to normal on his end before he can lend any kind of help to Sonic, who is currently dealing with the Time Meter. In Shadow's version of White Space, Shadow was able to freely move around in a 3D environment rather than a 2D space like the Sonic duo. This layout heavily reminds me of the hub worlds that were used in Unleashed, where you can provide a decent level of platforming, and if you take the time to explore the area, you can find some neat collectibles like artwork and soundtracks which are normally kept in these treasure boxes, certain parts that are used to help out several characters that are found in Shadow's White Space, and time trial missions that can be completed if you want to acquire more collectible items. A lot of the hub world isn't accessible at first, but as you acquire more of Shadow's abilities and unlock more levels, the rest of White Space will open up and turn into this massive playground where you're able to explore as you see fit. If you're going to try and complete everything that can be done in White Space, I highly recommend you wait until you play through the entirety of his campaign, just so you have access to all of Shadow's abilities, then you're free to go ham. There are two issues I have with White Space, however. One, there are moments where I found the design to be a bit too convoluted to my liking, as there are moments where I kinda struggled to figure out where the heck I was supposed to go, or got lost when I was attempting to find certain areas of interest. Plus, it does that thing where you do a few series of spring launches, rail grinding, and shooting yourself through hoops just to land nowhere. Either this is because I didn't trigger the right events to make this area relevant, or it really is just a path that leads to nothing and wastes my time. Speaking of wasting my time, this brings me to issue number 2 with White Space, the overall flow of progression. When you clear the stages and make your way over to the boss, you need to present a number of gate keys in order to unlock the boss battle in the exact same way that is done in Sonic's White Space, which is by completing a certain amount of optional challenges. The big difference between these two, Sonic's challenges are accessible from the jump the moment you clear all 3 of the zones that are in that era. For Shadow, however, the gate challenges do not unlock until you get to the boss room, then you need to go back to the areas where those challenges are, complete them, and then you gotta backtrack all the way to where the boss is. I didn't mind this the first time it happened because I figured the game was showing you how things were done around here, especially for players who had not played this game for a while or if they're new entirely. But once you get to the second area where traveling to the boss room is going to require a bit more effort to get there, this method wears out its welcome very quickly. It would have made a lot more sense to just have these gates appear once you've cleared the levels and then complete them right then and there, rather than having to require the player to find the boss room, backtrack to where the gates are, then having to double back to where the boss is located. But those are the only major gripes I have about White Space and how it's handled here. But now with that appetizer wrapped up, it's time we move on to the main course. Just like how it was done for Sonic, Shadow's levels consist of all the memorable stages throughout Shadow's history, barring one of the areas he will visit. Those stages being Space Colony Arc from SA2 and Shadow the Hedgehog, Rail Canyon from Sonic Heroes, Kingdom Valley from 06, Sunset Heights from Forces, Chaos Island from Frontiers, which is interesting because Shadow was never in that game whatsoever, and closing it off with Radical Highway from SA2. Starting with his Act 1 stages, players will be able to consistently move at blistering speeds in a full 3D environment without a 2D section in sight. This is exactly how a 3D Sonic game should be done moving forward. At first glance, it seems like Shadow is using the boost formula from Unleash, but what he's actually using is a similar engine taken straight out of Sonic Frontiers, except it is far more refined here. The controls for Shadow are not only snappy but highly responsive, allowing for players to appropriately react to anything as they're moving at high speeds without any real need to break their momentum. Not only that, but all of the control issues I had with Frontiers in a 3D cyberspace are gone. Shadow doesn't feel like he's running with restraints, he turns on a dime with ease, and his overall movement is smooth as butter. This is easily the most natural control schemes I've felt in a Sonic game for a very long time, and I was immensely surprised at how well Sega managed to nail Shadow's handling. It also helps that each of the 3D levels are designed around this formula, as none of the stage elements feel out of place, and once again nails the quota of what makes these Sonic games so fun to play, which is to present the player with multiple pathways they can take in order to reach the goal at the end. And let me tell you, there is absolutely no shortage of different pathways you can take in any of Shadow's levels. Some of these alternate routes are obvious and only require you to do things a tad bit differently, like choosing to use your Chaos Snap on a different enemy that's just chilling off to the side, while others require you to think outside of the box a little bit and be creative with Shadow's abilities in order to create a brand new path that you can take on your own. The latter feeling extremely rewarding when you're able to pull it off. It is because of these reasons I've been replaying these 3D stages way more than I expected to. If I had to pick which ones I enjoyed the most, that is easily Space Colony Arc, Kingdom Valley, and Radical Highway, with Kingdom Valley being at the top spot for me personally. Look, as much as I despise playing through 06 as that game is legitimately my kryptonite, a story for another time, Kingdom Valley is a favorite level of mine in that game purely for its aesthetics. To be able to play a version of Kingdom Valley where everything clicks and works as well as they should almost makes me wonder what 06 would have been like if it was actually a good game instead of the travesty that it's known for. Moving on to Act 2, all of these levels barring Radical Highway are done in a 2D perspective and still uses the Frontier engine, but once again it is far more refined here. These levels have a bigger aim on precision platforming instead of just blistering through these stages, which you're still able to do, but only if you're able to earn that speed by cheesing your way around these platforming sections to shave off as much time as possible. While I prefer the Act 1 levels, I actually did not mind playing through these 2D stages, mainly because once again, they did a fantastic job with how Shadow handles himself in these levels, unlike how things were done in Frontiers. Each of these levels contain their own set of gimmicks and a few puzzle platforming sprinkled in, leaving leaving it up to the player to figure out how they can weave around these obstacles or find some clever way to incorporate Shadow's moveset in order to shave off time. Admittedly, I'm not exactly the greatest when it comes to these levels, and that's only because I had not spent too much time on them as opposed to their 3D ones, but I will say that these do make for a nice little break in between all of the 3D action. The best part is, these levels are rather short compared to their 3D counterparts, and they don't overstay their welcome, as you often spend about 3 minutes or less on each of these. As far as the stage difficulty goes, you won't have too much of a hard time completing them. While difficulty spikes are kind of the norm for some of these Sonic games, you won't find any of them here at all, as all of these stages are well balanced across the board, progressively increasing the difficulty as you draw closer to the end, with Radical Highway putting the player to the absolute test. And even then, it is not nearly as difficult as stages like any of the levels in Unleash post Shamar. If you do end up struggling though, this campaign does away with lives entirely, so you're free to make those mistakes and improve as you go along while completing these stages for a better rank. Speaking of completing these stages, I absolutely love the fact that you not only get a different outro based on what rank you receive at the end, the music will sync itself to the rank display if you happen to get an A or an S, similar to how it was done in Sonic's campaign. As I always say, it's the little details I appreciate. Now, I have brought up Shadow's abilities several times in this video for a good reason. For the first time since 06, Shadow has a unique moveset to work with, as the devs incorporated his Chaos abilities right into his gameplay. At the start, Shadow has access to his Chaos Sphere, Chaos Control, and his Chaos Snap. The Chaos Snap automatically activates whenever he uses his homing attack on an enemy, teleporting to them instead of using his ball form. This is basically a slightly slower yet much cooler looking version of the homing attack Sonic uses, and while some players may prefer the snappy, faster version of the homing attack, I actually prefer the Chaos Snap simply because it not only fits the character and makes him stand out more, it also has a practical use behind it, as Shadow can now attack enemies that are hiding behind obstacles. That is why the delay is there in the first place. This is also a very on-brand thing for Shadow to do, especially since we've seen him warping in and striking enemies with punches and kicks far often than we see him attack anyone in ball form. So good on them for including this technique in the Shadow's moveset. The Chaos Sphere behaves exactly in the same way as it did in 06, where it paralyzes enemies in place and can be used to activate switches. Also, here's a neat little trick with the Chaos Sphere. If you happen to spam this move while you're in midair and boosting at the same time, you actually get to keep all of your momentum because Shadow removes any form of aerial drift as long as he's spamming this move. Mastering this tip is going to allow you to skip major parts of the levels that you wouldn't think it was possible unless you're doing this move. You're welcome for all you aspiring speedrunners out there. Then we have the Chaos Control, which is done by hitting the L2 trigger anytime the meter is filled up by defeating enough enemies or hitting a capsule that will fill it up instantly. Chaos Control outright freezes time for 5 seconds, allowing Shadow to bypass harmful obstacles or sometimes use them as platforms to reach certain areas. Sometimes I'll do it just to destroy enemies without giving them a second chance to react, then look away from them before they explode. Shadow can also stumble upon these green energy trails that behaves in a similar fashion for Lightspeed dashing if you happen to use your Chaos Control while you are right on top of them. You don't need to use these every time you see one, but it's often beneficial if you want to access a new pathing in order to shave off more time when you're trying to speedrun. Just bear in mind that anytime you enter the Doom Zone in some of these stages, you are locked out of using Chaos Control, so it's always a good idea to put it to use before it's lost forever. The fact that we're finally able to play a game where Chaos Control is a core ability we have at our fingertips further adds to the authentic Shadow experience we've been lacking in the previous games where he's playable. Best part is, these are not the only abilities we get throughout Shadow's campaign. Whenever you kick the life out of the Doomites you'll encounter in the Doom Zone, then report back over to Whitespace, the Doom Towers will open up and Shadow will be given a new ability once he approaches them. The Doom Sphere is the first one you'll get, which is basically an upgraded version of the Chaos Sphere that will allow him to strike up to 5 targets instead of 1. The Doom Blast is my top favorite ability, as this not only lets you pummel the crap out of certain enemies, you're also able to launch them in the air, then you're able to aim wherever you want to kick them next. Shadow will then teleport to wherever they land, which is very useful for accessing areas outside of the beaten path. The Doom Surf lets Shadow move across water without sinking, but keep in mind that it never stops moving once he's on this sucker. Then we have the Doom Morph. This form allows Shadow to move around corrupted areas, and he can also perform some Spider Hog action by slinging himself across these corrupted spheres that are hovering around. I'm not a fan of this ability at all, as it often felt clunky to use, especially when you have to swing around from place to place. In fact, I was expecting to hold a lot of L's during the final boss fight where you have to rely on this form in your battle against Doom. But by that point, I grew accustomed to it, thankfully. Still, I would prefer not to deal with it altogether. This is also the reason why Chaos Island is my least favorite level to play. Man, even in a different game, I still don't like Chaos Island all that much. But at least there isn't an unforgiving pinball minigame. Finally, we have the Doom Wing. This ability is kind of like a pseudo super form, as you need 50 rings in order to activate it. Once you clear that condition, Shadow will be given the ability to glide across the levels, letting him skip major sections because of it. But keep in mind that not only your rings will count down much like a super form would, your glide is also not indefinite and you will eventually have to land. So you need to take that in consideration before you're able to glide around all willy-nilly. Additionally, the Doom Wing becomes an optional power-up you can use in every stage once you've unlocked it, which further encourages players to replay those stages just to see what areas you can cheese with this power-up. Now let's talk about these boss fights. Once again, like Sonic's campaign, Shadow will fight against several bosses that he's dealt with in the past. Those bosses being the Bile Lizard, Metal Overlord, Mephiles, and of course, Devil Doom. Each of these boss fights will challenge the player's mastery over the new skills Shadow has acquired, as they all require Shadow's Doom power-up in order to take them down, with Devil Doom testing the player on how well they can use all of these abilities in a single battle. These boss fights are also hella fun to fight against, as they don't present any form of dull moments where you often have to wait your turn before you're able to fight them. From start to finish, these fights will have you in constant motion while presenting you with one spectacular scene after the next, creating some memorable and arguably better versions from their original fights. There are even some unique exchanges that can happen in these fights, such as how Metal Overlord will respond if you use Chaos Control on him. As much as I hated using the Doom Morph, Mephiles is easily my favorite boss fight out of every battle here. I didn't think Sega would go ahead and reference that scene during his intro. The battle itself is a spectacle to behold, especially when you get to sit there and pummel Mephiles like he owes you money. But one of the biggest things I really like about this fight is how it ends, as it has Shadow delivering one of the coldest responses he could say to this character.
There is no future for you. Ever.
I want to reiterate that I despise playing 06, but it is amusing that most of my favorite moments happens to be from the elements of that game. Overall, the boss fights are handled very well in Shadow Generations, as I do not loathe a single one of them. One other area of the game that I do want to bring attention to are the action scenes that will take place throughout your adventure, whether you are transitioning from the normal world to the Doom Zone, to the action sequences that will take place during the boss fights. At first, I was indifferent to these because I am someone who prefers to play the game rather than having the controls taken from me to watch a movie in the middle of the action. And yeah, Shadow Generations does this quite frequently, a little more than I'd like. However, I do need to give credit where credit is due, because this is by far the cleanest action sequences I've seen in a Sonic game, period. Playing this game multiple times and watching these cutscenes play out during my recording made me realize just how much effort Sega had put into these action scenes that I would often expect to see in other games like Devil May Cry or Bayonetta. Seeing these cutscenes in almost the same caliber as those examples I gave out caught me off guard, but in a good way. Now granted, I would still rather play the game more, but I do appreciate seeing Shadow in these high octane cutscenes that allow the Hedgehog to show everyone why he is the ultimate life form. Once you're done with everything, you are encouraged to speedrun these levels and upload your results online for the entire world to see and have them attempt at beating your rank. This is also a great way to compete against your own friends who happen to have the same game and find out who's really the fastest one among your group. You can perform runs that use the Doom Wing, or you can completely omit that power up and go wingless. It's entirely up to you. Additionally, players can activate the Doom Zone anytime they're in white space by interacting with the Doom Spear sitting in the hub world. Doing so will make all of the challenges harder while unlocking additional ones that are only exclusive to this zone, plus all of the boss fights will be upgraded to a harder difficulty. These harder challenges will put your overall mastery of Shadow's abilities to the test, as you will need to be quick on the draw so you can react to any additional obstacles and enemies, as they can easily catch you off guard. As for those bosses, they now pack more health and attack more frequently or move faster. Plus some of these fights will contain no rings at all. I'm gonna warn you up front, you better have a good handle on using that Doom Morph before you even attempt Mephiles' hard mode battle. I did finish it, but not in an efficient way that Shadow would approve of. I can also say that this is one of the few times where Sega actually got an idea on how to make these challenges difficult, but not hair-pulling difficult. You know what I mean? They tend to have a real hard time balancing that. If Sonic Frontiers had anything to say about that, oh boy, that's a story for another time. So if you want the game to have a bit more bite to its difficulty and really put yourself to the test, the Doom Zone will welcome you with open arms. Or should I say, black arms. Shadow Generations as an entire package is an experience that had me smiling from ear to ear the entire time I was playing it. Back when I reviewed Frontiers, I had said something along the lines that Frontiers provided Sega with enough groundwork for them to improve upon should they wish to make a new game using the same formula, and Shadow Generations is the end result of what happens when they polish what they already have. Despite my earlier criticisms, this is easily one of the best experiences I've had with a Sonic game up to this point, where I have replayed this campaign several times and even bothered to try and learn different strategies so I can improve my rank and hopefully avoid blunders like this one here. Overall, Shadow Generations is an absolute delight, and while I highly doubt Sega will ever witness this video, I want them to take what they've done here with this game and apply it to their next major project. There is a reason why this game is getting high scores all across the board from everyone who's talked about it and reviewed it so far, and I can also assure you that those scores are justified. While they have messed up with Sonic Superstars, I still stand by what I said at the end of the Sonic Frontiers video, that Sonic's future looks promising as long as they continue to improve and keep that same energy going. But anyway, that is all I have for you today. If you enjoyed this video, feel free to hit me with that siggity sub, like this video as it will help out with that YouTube algorithm, and I hope I get to see y'all in the next one. Laters everyone!